Hey, Dr. Alan Christensen here with you. So I've gotten oodles and oodles of questions about vitamin D. Is it really important? How much should I be taking? What types are best? Is it dangerous if I get too much? What about my thyroid? What about overall health? These are super good questions. And the answers have a lot of variations based upon you. So I want to take some time with you and just talk through these variations and what they might mean. And opening thing, we know that vitamin D strengthens the immune system. We know that those who have low levels of vitamin D are overrepresented for getting ill, for catching acute infections, and for having complications from them. We know that vitamin D reduces the risk for respiratory infections, it regulates cytokine production, and it can limit the risk of other viruses, such as influenza. Now, a funny concept is there's a little debate as to how much vitamin D is important onto itself and how much it's a marker for good health otherwise. Think about it. The more you are outside, the more you're active, or someone has an easy time regulating body weight, our age. Those are all things that the younger we are, the healthier we are, the more likely we are to have good vitamin D levels. And on the other hand, the more we have chronic illness, the more we have spending time indoors being sedentary, the more likely we are to be lower in that. So there are some debates as to how much it's important onto itself. But we've got good data, especially from trials showing those who supplement with it. We know that it does make some differences, that it probably is a marker for other habits, but it's also something that's really critical by itself. So before we get even much further at all into vitamin D, a super important thing I've got to throw out is that there are completely different units for vitamin D that are in circulation. Now, one of these are the units that are most commonly used in medical research in the journals that we read, and that's nanomoles per liter. The other one is the most common units in blood tests, and that's nanograms per mil. Now, the conversion, basically nanomoles per liter is a higher number. So you take nanograms per mil, multiply that by 2.5, and you get nanomoles per liter. And reverse to convert back. You divide nanomoles per liter by 2.5, you got nanograms per mil. Now, I say this because I've seen so many times to where someone reads a paper that talks about there being a good level of vitamin D in the range of perhaps 70 to 125 nanomoles per liter, and they think, oh my goodness, my blood levels are much lower than that. But their blood levels are nanograms per mil. So it's a whole different ballgame. So this creates tons and tons of confusion. And I'm going to, by and large, stick with nanograms per mil when I talk about this, because that's what you're going to see on your blood tests. But please know that I've seen many really good discussions about vitamin D that didn't notice that they were talking about those two things interchangeably, that they were talking about a paper suggesting benefits to being at blood levels per nanomoles per liter, but they were converting that into nanograms per mil inadvertently. So just please know that that's a big distinction. Whenever you hear recommendations, double check closely because they can get that wrong. So something else to address early along, I have heard some arguments saying that we shouldn't take vitamin D or vitamin A right now because of the possible ACE2 receptor effects that these nutrients could have. Now, that's an argument based upon a mechanism. However, there's a lot of solid human data showing that these things really can be useful. So mechanisms, like little molecular ways things work, if the mechanism isn't possible, well, something probably can't happen. But just because the mechanism is possible doesn't mean it will happen. So like the lottery, you can't win if you don't play, but just because you're playing doesn't mean you'll win. So it's very easy to dismiss arguments based upon mechanism. So we know that there's also a lot of relevance for vitamin D with this current infection and also related viruses in general, especially influenza. And what we've seen is that the predictive effect is relevant for those who get ill and for those who have complications. And there's good evidence showing that serum levels of vitamin D, which relates to vitamin D intake, does have dramatic effects upon risks for complications. And it's interesting because in some ways, this may explain why some groups have more complications than others. As we talk more about vitamin D, I'll mention how those who are heavier tend to have lower serum levels. Well, that may be why obesity causes greater risk factors for COVID-19. It may be that they have lower vitamin D levels because of it. And there's also big differences in skin pigmentation. The more pigmented someone's skin is, the more they are apt to be low in vitamin D, and the more apt they are to have risks and complications with COVID, both for catching it and for complications from it. So this may be a connection that way as well. But strong evidence that those who are deficient in vitamin D have the greatest complications, and those who are sufficient are going to do well. And sufficient in nanograms per mil, we used to define that, or I should say some define that, as greater than 20 nanograms per mil was sufficient. But what we're seeing now is that those that have the lowest risk of developing COVID-19 and developing complications seem to be higher than that. So how much higher? Probably 30 to 50 nanograms per mil. So a bit higher. And I've seen many health experts talk about people being higher and using nanomoles per liter, but then conflating that into nanograms per mil. So yeah, so nanomoles per liter, you hear that number, that's higher yet. That's going to be like 75 to 125 in terms of a real healthy range. But that's not what you see in your blood tests in America in almost all cases. Now, vitamin D, it's good for cutting your risk of getting an infection or having complications from it, but we can't think about one facet of health, right? We've got to think about your thyroid function. We've got to think about your overall health and your risk for all diseases. It's important for all those things. And there could be a situation in which vitamin D at some level over here would be very good for something that you may not get, but it could be much better for like longevity if it were here. And then we've got to think that through. Now, thankfully, these things overlap pretty well. There's not a disparity in terms of how much vitamin D is best for your immune system, best for your thyroid, and best for your long-term health. So we'll talk about that. In terms of thyroid disease, we've got good data that those who are low in vitamin D are at greater risk for developing and having complications from Hashimoto's disease, Graves' disease, and thyroid cancer. Now, this one also has kind of a fascinating little wrinkle in that vitamin D, is that a chicken or an egg? It seems that adequate thyroid hormones are necessary to maintain vitamin D status. So if your thyroid hormones are not right, that might goof up your vitamin D scores. So was it really that vitamin D caused the thyroid to become abnormal, or was it that thyroid levels caused vitamin D to become abnormal? Well, we've got good evidence that it is relevant because we have data showing that supplemental vitamin D does have beneficial effects upon thyroid antibodies. So even independent of thyroid blood levels, you're more likely to have healthy thyroid antibody levels when you've got reasonable vitamin D levels. And especially anti-thyroid peroxidase. Many papers have shown that vitamin D can lower the risks for abnormal levels of anti-thyroid peroxidase. And how much have they used in those studies? Well, it's varied quite a bit. Some have been as low as 2,000 units. Some have been as high as 10,000 units. But most settle in somewhere around 4,000 units per day. We'll talk more about units, dosages, and how they really equate to blood levels. Then we think about total mortality risks. And you could argue that this is probably the most important thing of all. If your thyroid or anything else does better, but your mortality risks don't improve, that wasn't a win. Nothing is good if you die early, right? So mortality risks are super important. And what we see is that there's this C-shaped curve or a J-shaped curve, they call that. And what that means is when you're really deficient in vitamin C, mortality rates go higher. But also when there's way too much vitamin D, mortality rates go higher. And I want to make a distinction. There's toxicity. There's a place at where you're getting so much, it's just hurting your body, right? But apart from toxicity, which is way out here, there's a point at where above some threshold, the benefits are just not quite as apparent. The benefits start to drop off. And they plateau, the benefits plateau around 50 nanograms per mil, and they start to decrease the further you get above that. And once you're talking about well over 70 nanograms per mil, the benefits are just plummeting. So they're much less pronounced. And that's why I say that sweet spot is about 30 to 50. That's where you're seeing the bulk of the benefits. There have been some papers showing above 50 is negative, but most clearly show that above 50, there's no more increased returns. And the further you get above that, the more we get decreased returns. So vitamin D, important stuff. Well, where's it coming from? Well, your skin makes it in response to sun exposure, and we can get it from dietary sources. And I'll start with the dietary sources first, because they're pretty easy to talk about. They're not really that significant. Now, a couple of exceptions. There are fortified dairy products that contain vitamin D, and honestly, they are a different form than our bodies use as much. There are some debates as to how effective it is. It probably does work, but it's not consistently absorbed, and it may not be as well metabolized. And by and large, if you're getting that much intake of processed dairy foods, there could be other things off with the diet. And especially relevant to thyroid function, to rely that heavily on dairy foods could put you easily at risk for being above your best target for your iodine status. So wouldn't rely upon dairy foods. There are non-cow-based dairy foods that are fortified with vitamin D, like your rice milk, almond milk type products, but typically, again, not consistent sources that are always that effective. So regular foods, well, there's some in mushrooms, sardines, seafood, a lot of little bits in most types of produce, but we're not talking about needle movers. We're not talking about enough to really make a difference and change your blood levels. One kind of a fun exotic exception would be there have been some work done on exposing mushrooms to UV light. So you grow mushrooms and you put them out in the sun for a while, and they may actually get substantial amounts of vitamin D, but it's not a simple process. It's a couple of days of exposure to a lot of mushrooms on a daily basis, and it's not the mushrooms you get in your supermarket. They haven't been treated in those ways. So not really practical and not useful in that sense. One food source that actually is really high is cod liver oil. So it is a food. It does contain very high amounts of that. It also has a lot of vitamin A. It's got essential fats, and it's not something I recommend that you take. So the concern is hypervitaminosis A. You can get a toxic amount of vitamin A. And I'm going to get a little sad here talking about this. I think that we're often quick to dismiss the dangers of vitamins. You know, the culture that I was educated in, I think that was our bias, that vitamins are safe. You know, vitamins and herbs are safe. And I would say they're safer, they're safe-ish, you know, but they're not harmless. There was a man who was a mentor of mine early along and got me very interested in the more traditional ways of eating. And at the time when I was first in training, it was all extreme low fat, you know, and I saw benefits to dietary protein and healthy fats. And this was a gentleman who was a precursor of what became the paleo movement. And I think the paleo movement, I don't know, when it got fearful of foods, I started separating in some ways, but advocating for a bigger range of foods and more traditional human foods, I'm all for that. And this gentleman wrote some good books about that, and we were personal friends. He was a mentor, and I followed in his tracks in some ways. He was an advocate of cold pressed fermented cod liver oil and consumed amounts of that on a regular basis. Sadly, he died a couple of years ago. He was barely 70 years old. He died of congestive heart failure, and he wrote some public letters in his final days about how he died from hypervitaminosis A. He said that he didn't follow his own advice well enough. He took too much of that, and it was not a product he considered safe anymore. He no longer recommended it, but for him, it was too late. So, yeah, a tragic thing, a real loss, and that's why I'm really a safety nut. I'm really neurotic about those things because you don't get do-overs. You know, there are ways in which we can screw up, and there are things you can do trying to help your health that shorten your lifespan, and we don't get to try over. So anything that's of any risk like that, I don't even want to get close to it. And yeah, this is a real thing. It can happen. I've seen that happen to people. So not a fan of cod liver oil for that reason. Well, where else does vitamin D come from? Well, there's sunlight. And sunlight, we got to think about how much are you getting right now, you know, during shelter in place. And we want to think through too about where you live, what your skin pigments are like, and how much of your skin really gets exposed. So let's talk first about where you live and how your latitude affects that. I'm going to share an image with you here. And there we go. Let me make sure this is showing up properly. Okay. Sharing screen, and there we go. That's what I wanted to see. So this is the sunshine calendar, you can call it. And you can look at your latitude and you can look at your time of year, the month, and you can see how readily you would form vitamin D. Now, one way it can be kind of tricky is because those suns, the nun, the yellow, the orange, and the red, they appear to move across the globe. But really, wherever you are in your latitude, that sun per month is relevant for you. So for example, in the United States, if you can look at the northern portion of the United States, like the Great Lakes, there's that blank circle right over there. That's pretty much where I grew up, northern Minnesota, right under that blank circle. So what that means is February or January in that latitude, anywhere in that row, you're not going to make vitamin D from sunlight. It just is not going to happen. But if you look at March, April, May, you could make a speck. And if you look at June, July, August, you could make some. Now, if you go down to the next level below, we're seeing more like where I am now, the desert Southwest, Florida, the southern parts of the United States. There you can make some throughout the year. In the summer, you can make a lot. But other parts of the country, it's going to depend a lot on your time of year. If you go in the next latitude up, like where London, England is, they're quite far north. They don't make much during the majority of the year. So yeah, look at the sunshine calendar, and we'll talk more about your skin's exposure. But if you're not at a place where you can make much of it, and you're not outside during the middle of the day for significant amounts of time, that won't even be relevant. So now I want to talk about the skin types. And this is a commonly used concept in dermatology. This is called the Fitzpatrick skin scale. And we've got 6 different types on this. And by and large, these are just differences about how pigmented skin is. Now, to get really nerdy for a second, type 1 is really not less pigment than type 2. It's actually a different pigment. So Fitzpatrick skin type 1, which includes Caucasian redheads, they make a pigment called eumelanin, EU melanin, so not melanin. The types 2 through 6, they all make melanin, but they make more or less melanin. That's the only difference. So the Fitzpatrick type 1, that's noticeable by red hair or by pretty extensive freckling that stays and persists. Type 2 is still fair, and there can be some freckling, but it's mostly just where there's a lot of sun exposure and it doesn't persist quite as much. But the general concept here is that the melanin, the pigment, it's protecting you from vitamin D overdose. So the more pigment you have, the more sun that it takes to form vitamin D. Now, why would this be a thing? Well, vitamin D is formed at the expense of a fair amount of free radical exposure to UV light. So you need a lot of free radical formation to make vitamin D. And you do use a lot of methylation substrates like folate. Your body burns through a lot of folate, no pun intended, in the utilization of vitamin D. So if you're making vitamin D unchecked, you would make huge amounts of free radicals. And if you're somewhere, like say you're living in Northern Europe, you're getting so little concentrated sun, think about our last image, that you've got to make the vitamin D with whatever sun you've got. So you've got very little pigment to block the vitamin D formation because you need that. Now, if you're somewhere like sub-Saharan Africa, you've got a lot of sun constantly, you're equatorial. And in those cases, if you were making vitamin D all the time, you would just fill up with free radicals and you could not function. And this is a funny thing because yes, it is about sunburns. Yes, it is about long-term skin cancer risk, but it's much more apparent than that. So those with type 1 or type 2, especially type 1, we get sun poisoned. I mean, you get wiped out and exhausted from too much sun exposure. And not even just the heat, but just sun on your skin. So we need those pigments to protect us when we are endemic to areas that have more sun exposure. But the flip side of that is the more pigmented your skin is, the more apt you are to be vitamin D deficient. If you had 6 people that each had one of those skin types and they all had the same sun formation, and assuming that they had the same dietary and supplemental vitamin D intake, you could predict who would have the highest vitamin D levels based upon how fair they were. Now, here's the other wrinkle. If that were all there were to it, then we could just say, oh, if you're light, you'll be outside, you'll be fine. Well, no, it's not that easy either, because we're also the ones most apt to get the skin cancers. So this is a no-win situation. This is why the sun is really tricky. If you're fair, then you're managing your risk for burns and cancer by trying to get a lot of vitamin D from sunlight. If you're not fair, you're going to have a tough time getting vitamin D without massive amounts of sunlight, more than is easy to get in the modern world in our latitudes. In the northern latitudes, it just won't happen. So it's tough. It's pretty tough to do it just from sun. And I had another image here. This is some examples of celebrities that were of this type. Let me make this bigger so it's more clear. Yeah, I'm going to get this a little smaller if I can. Oops, next one down. Well, anyway. So the top row, this is basically Fitzpatrick 1, 2, and 3 across the top row. I'm kind of embarrassed, but I'm really bad at pop culture. I know that's Gwyneth Paltrow in the middle because I know that she's got a famous health website. I know about that. The other gals I've seen before, I don't really know them. And then on the bottom, we've got numbers 3 through 6 right across. So there's difference in terms of just the pigmentation, and then also differences in terms of the type of pigment. And this is a pretty good analogy of that. So if you're not sure where you are, here's some ways you can get a sense of that. But also with the skin type, you can see based upon typical skin colorations, a sense about that. So then the other thought is, yes, you've got the various skin types, you've got your various exposures, but then how much time are you really out in the sun, and how much of your skin is exposed to sunlight on a regular basis? I mean, this is a really big thing too. So past your skin type, then we think about how much exposure you're having, how much actual exposure your skin is getting. And in this case, this can be pretty surprising. So if you're like the gal over here on the left, dressed the way that most of us dress, except for when we're outside in the summer, well, you're getting like maybe 10% skin exposure. So the gentleman and the gal that are in beachwear, they've got about 66 or 80% skin exposure. But how often are we outside dressed like that? Most of us are dressed somewhere between the gentleman at 16% and the gal at 40%. So in these cases, there's not a whole lot of skin that's doing much of anything. And even if you are of a pigment that can form it well enough, and if you are at a latitude and a time of year to where it's available, how much of your skin is really getting the sun, So that's why it's tricky. And again, if you are 80% gal and you are in a latitude that's getting adequate sun, and your skin is light enough to easily form it, well, then you're at risk for getting too much irritation from that. And it's real. The skin cancer risks are real. And if you're otherwise, it's just, if you can make it, you're also at risk for skin cancer. If you can't make it very well, you need tons of exposure. So that's the tough trade-off. Now, another big wrinkle that individualizes your vitamin D needs is just body size. So what happens is body fat, subcutaneous fat especially, stores and sequesters, it holds on to vitamin D. So this is based upon the body mass index, and I quickly want to just put this chart up there so you would know where you would be on this scale. This scale has limitations. It's not perfect for a lot of reasons, but we do know that it predicts vitamin D status per intake or per sun exposure. So this is now not even just sun, but also pills. The more that the higher the BMI is, the more vitamin D you would need to get to the same level. So if a woman was, say, 5'6", over here, why do we go to focus mode? Okay, focus mode. Here we go. If a woman were 5'6" and she were 140 pounds, that's going to put her BMI right here at 22. So, pretty normal. It's easy to have a higher BMI. It's not at all uncommon. And if you're at overweight or obese or extremely obese, we'll talk about how that changes your vitamin D requirements. But it's pretty dramatic stuff. So what we've seen from some papers is that those who are in the range of the BMI above 30, their need for vitamin D, it could be 2 or 3 times what it would be otherwise. So yeah, the exact same amount of vitamin D, someone could need 2 times as much or 3 times as much just per their body size. So huge difference. And what we've seen too is that that's a big part of why the different dose of vitamin D can yield different blood levels for the same people. So you've got a group of people and someone's taking 5,000 units per day. They've got a blood level over here. Now, this is nanomoles per liter, so please see that. And to convert, the sweet spot is probably somewhere in this range right about here, this 75 to 125 nanomoles per liter, which is about 30 to 50 nanograms per mil. But to get there, many people can do fine on small amounts. There's a lot of folks that are in this range, but others might need a lot more. And you'll see some to where they're still at the upper end of a good range, but they're above 10,000 units per day. So this happens. There's a big curve that way. And this was done out of a group of 17,000 people. So a really big distribution. And some were above their target way over here. But yeah, there's some like this, for example, in this little group to where they needed 15,000 units to get to what? Roughly 100, so roughly 40 nanograms per mil. So some need a lot. And this happens. People often say that they take it and their levels don't change, something's wrong with them. No, people are different in terms of how much they need, and some need more than others. The biggest reasons we know those differences are body size, pigmentation, and sun exposure. But those are reasons why not everyone needs the same amounts. So now I want to talk about different versions of vitamin D in terms of how it's found in supplementation. We've got different types of that, and the version that's most biologically active is vitamin D3. That's really the preferred, and that's the one that has the most consistent effects upon benefiting the blood levels and also doing all the things that vitamin D seems to do in the body. And that's a lot. We've known forever that vitamin D is critical for bone health. And when I was training in, even in nutritional medicine, not just medicine, but in the world of nutrition, the thought was that vitamin D was necessary to keep you from getting rickets, and osteomalacia. So you had basic bone health. And if you were an Inuit and you were in the northern part of the world, you had zero sun exposure, and you were no longer on a traditional diet, you could get rickets. And so they would have you stand up, and disrobe and be in front of a UV lamp to make some vitamin D. That's what all that we learned about it, and that you needed somewhere at least 400 units a day to not be deficient. And then over the coming years, the data just exploded about vitamin D affecting your brain health and your gut function and your immune response and chronic inflammation and chronic pain and tissue regeneration and basal metabolic rate and everything else. So we now know it's working all over the place. And D3 is the best version that's relevant in that context for supplemental forms. And from what we know about food sources, safe food sources not being as relevant, and about sunshine, frankly, being hit or miss. I think there are a lot of benefits to sun that don't just equate to vitamin D. So we know there are ways that the sunlight that you do see in your eyes does affect your pineal gland and your melatonin production and your serotonin production. So I think it's good to have some sun exposure. It's good to be in the sun per your tolerances, per your safety. But I don't think vitamin D is you can consistently raise your vitamin from the sun alone without running the risks of skin cancers. They're real risks. And yeah, those of us who are really good at making vitamin D, we're really prone to skin cancers. That's a trade-off. So the sun is hit or miss for vitamin D. It's great to be outside. And the diet is hit or miss, so we're talking about supplements. And the first thing I want to mention just in a little more detail is what your real targets would be. So we're thinking about infectious disease risk, about thyroid health, and about longevity. And you want to give up none of those. They're all important. And thankfully, your best targets aren't that different from one to the next. So really, 30 to 50 nanograms per mil is probably the sweet spot. Now, I wish that was larger. We talk about like windows of opportunity. Well, I like barn doors of opportunity. I like massive, easy places in which it's easy to fit. If I had a magic wand, you'd be fine from like 10 to 1,000 nanograms per mil. Like anywhere would be good. You couldn't be outside of it. Or if it could at least be broader, if it could be like 20 to 100 nanograms per mil, that would be awesome. In that case, pretty much no matter what you did, you probably wouldn't overdose easily and you wouldn't get too little. But it's not the case. It's a rather exacting target for vitamin D. It's a narrower range than I would like. And how do you know what your needs are and what you should do? Well, what I encourage is having a baseline amount of vitamin D that's in the context of your multivitamin supplementation. We'll talk a little bit more about how you need a lot of nutrients besides vitamin D for your best immune health and for your best health in a lot of ways. So they work in orchestration. So you need to have some comprehensive supplementation for that. And this is not an either or. You want a good diet. It's not that there's really a false dichotomy between a healthy diet and supplementation. They're both critical, and there's ways in which they overlap, and there's also ways in which they're distinct, in which one does things that the other really cannot. So they're both critical. You want vitamin D in the context of other micronutrients. And I would encourage a baseline level of 2,000 IUs for any adult, apart from those under specialized guidance. Pregnant, lactating can have different needs. But general adult health, 2,000 IUs is a really good baseline to start from. And we'll talk more about how to personalize that for those who may have a BMI, body mass index, higher than 25. Those who have Fitzpatrick scores that are greater than 3, 3 and above, they can need higher amounts. Those who live in higher latitudes, New York, Seattle, Minneapolis, those who are not outside for half an hour a day, midday. It's midday right now, I'm not outside. And those who, when they're outside, they don't have 40% or more of their skin being exposed. Now, another wrinkle is that stomach function may affect vitamin D absorption. So you do want to have vitamin D with food, with a solid meal. And your baseline dose, your 0 to 2,000 IUs, it seems less critical which form you have, whether it's a tablet, capsule, or not. That first little amount probably will absorb. Once you get to higher amounts, the further you get above 4,000 per day, the more absorption gets dicey. And this is also where people have a hard time noticing what's happening because they take it and their blood levels may not change that much. And it's not because it won't work, it's because now when you're above that 2,000 to 4,000 unit threshold, absorption becomes more relevant. And many with thyroid disease, we see that 30 to 40% with thyroid disease may have autoimmune gastritis. And that means they can't absorb nutrients as well from supplements as they could otherwise. And in those cases, liquid is really a good way to go. I like vitamin D liquid forms. The perk about that is it's good to have that on top of your base supplementation if you need more on top of your base supplementation. And we'll talk more about who does. Many can. Liquids are nice because they're well absorbed, but also you can easily titrate and adjust the amounts as your needs go. So let's talk a bit about how vitamin D works in the context of other micronutrients. So I'm going to get another image for you. Okay, share screen. Here we go. And this one is crazy, incredibly detailed and interesting. So we think about the nutrients that contribute to the overall integrity of your immune response. And D is there. Yep, so is vitamin A, vitamin C, E, B6, B12, folate, iron, and zinc. It doesn't mean you've got to take all those things together. It means you can't be lacking in any of those things. We think about how nutrients affect, that's your body's physical barriers. That's your secretory IgA. That's to keep things from getting in. And we think about your innate immune response, how well your cells can protect you non-specifically. We've got the vitamins C and E, iron, zinc, copper, selenium, magnesium. We think also about our specific immune response, like our cell-mediated immunity. So more so attacking specific antibodies with antigens to help target. And now we're talking about the same list of all the vitamins. Then regulating inflammation. We've got all the vitamins here. We've got T cell proliferation, differentiation, and function. Here we've got all the same darn vitamins and all the way through. So inhibitory actions, cell-mediated immunity, antibody production and function, antimicrobial activity. So the gist of it is that all of your immune system needs all of your nutrients. There's really not a role where you just need vitamin D, you just need vitamin A, you just need vitamin C or zinc. They're all critical and they're all relevant overall. And none of them benefit you by being present in unusual massive amounts. It's really how they work in orchestration that's important. So the other big thing about vitamin D is its bone health. And I love to talk about this too, because this is a critical understanding of how it works in context, but also how it can be bad when things are out of context. So when we think about nutrients that affect bone metabolism, here was an evaluation that showed which were the most critical in terms of predicting good bone health and lowest fracture risk in typical daily intakes. So first and foremost in this one was protein. And the mean intake was 128 grams of protein per day for optimal bone health. Now that's body sized, but bones are part of your lean body mass, and protein's critical for healthy lean body mass. I won't cover all of these, but you always think about calcium, and calcium is incredibly important for bone health, but not in a sense of just the more the better. So calcium, it can mineralize. It can make your bones well mineralized and strong, but it can also calcify. It can create calcified lesions that create heart disease and create joint calcification and create gallstones and kidney stones. So it can do bad things. And how it works is a function of how your body absorbs it and how your body ionizes it and how you convert it and metabolize it with osteocalcin. And that's highly relevant to your vitamin D status, but also your vitamin K status. So that's just as critical. And if you do correct vitamin D deficiencies that don't have appropriate vitamin K status, then you can do more calcification than you would have otherwise. And you can perhaps stimulate bone growth, but go the wrong way in raising the risk for cardiovascular harm. And we've had many papers showing that people with higher calcium intakes that don't have proper vitamin D status and vitamin K and the right versions of calcium do have greater risk for cardiovascular harm. That's been shown up quite commonly. So I'm going to stop this. So the thought is really to have these things in a proper spectrum. And in our world, this is the daily reset pack. You know, I've included vitamin K. Whatever you do, you want to get a spectrum of vitamin K. You've got the phytonadione, you've got the menaquinone, and there's some patented versions like MenaQ7, which is MK6, MK7, MK9. And vitamin K is really a spectrum of nutrients. So you want that full spectrum. For good bone health and immune health, you want some zinc, not a massive amount, and you want a well-absorbed type, but I like 15 milligrams of zinc bisglycinate. You want some manganese bisglycinate, a milligram is best. You want some copper, some chelated well-absorbed copper. Calcium, I like calcium and magnesium to be pretty close together, and if you've got plant-derived well-absorbed calcium, you don't need massive amounts because it's soluble, it goes where you want it. You see, a lot of calcium gets wasted on calcification, and it can't help your bones mineralize because it's being wasted on all of these negative calcification reactions. But the nice thing about plant-derived dicalcium malate is it won't do that. It's really going to focus much more on mineralization. Vitamin C is appropriate, and I like that baseline amount of vitamin D of 2,000 units as a real starting dose for someone. And you want these things, you want to take them with food. And the nutrients overall, the reset pack, I've made that to where you take that twice daily. Now, if you're taking extra vitamin D, you can take that at just 1 time per day. So here's some thoughts on that extra vitamin D. I like liquid forms. They're better absorbed, especially when you're above that 2,000, 4,000 unit basal dose. It can be hard to absorb extra vitamin D. And many that have thyroid disease have autoimmune gastritis that may not absorb it that well. So liquids are great. How do you use a liquid? Take the drop or a couple of drops, put them right in your mouth. You can wash that down with water, but you want to be eating a meal. So you want to do that during meal time to absorb that consistently. Now, I've seen a lot of different versions of liquid vitamin D. I prefer ones that are 1,000 IUs per drop. And I like ones that are bigger drops. How do you know how big the drops are? Well, this is pretty easy. You can see how many drops there are per ounce. The larger drops are about 500, 600 drops per ounce. I've seen some to where the droppers are so small that it's about 900 or 1,000 drops per ounce. And the drawback when the drops are that small, they vary tremendously in size from drop to drop. I've done assays on that in science labs before. And little tiny drops, you put them on a microgram scale, and they're all over the place in their size. So this is a function of the hydrogen bonds and the surface tension of liquids. But when drops are too small, you don't know how big they're going to be, basically. So I like bigger drops, where it's more like 500 to 600 drops per ounce. That's a size that you can accurately calibrate. And yeah, I like 1,000 units per drop. I see many that are 2,000 units per drop. And one mindset is, oh, wow, that's more powerful. Well, yeah, it's also more chaotic. And you can't adjust that as closely. If you had 30,000 units per drop, that would not be better because you want a tiny fraction of that drop and you couldn't control it. So at the same time, if you had like 1 unit per drop, and you got a lot of drops to count. So I love 1,000 units per drop as a good trade-off for those different things. So yeah, 1,000 units per drop, about 500 to 600 drops per ounce for a good, consistent drop size, consistent measurements. Don't put these in smoothies or liquids or beverages. So don't add them to other things. Take them straight in your mouth. Put the drops straight in your mouth. You can wash that down with food, with water, but don't mix it in a glass of water beforehand. So definitely at mealtime. Now, how much do you want to take? Well, do your basal amounts in your overall supplementation, like the Reset Pack. And if you know that you have blood levels that are between 30 and 50 nanograms per mil, or 75 to 125 nanomoles per liter, if you know you're there on that much, don't change a thing. You're doing awesome. Some people need more, and you can test first, but it's reasonable to do a good starting dose first and then test after you've been on that. If you're at a reasonable dose, you won't likely be getting too much. And as things stand now, I'd rather see you corrected and on a good range and fine-tune later rather than wait a long time for testing results. And it can be hard to get to draw stations right now. So I would do a good baseline dose first and then check down the road. So how do you know if you need more? Well, if your BMI is 25 to 30, add on 1 extra drop. If your BMI is over 31, add on 2 extra drops. And in addition to that, if you're at a higher latitude, if you're somewhere above the middle of the country, add 1 more drop onto that. If you got a Fitzpatrick score that's between 2 to 4, add on 1 more drop. If your Fitzpatrick score is 5 to 6, add on 2 more drops. So altogether, if you had dark skin, you were at a higher latitude, and your BMI was greater than 31, we could be talking about, 2, 4, 5 additional drops. So quite reasonable for a starting place. So anywhere from 0 to 5 drops to add on top of your basal amounts. And again, more of that if you're at a higher body mass index, if you're at a higher latitude, or if you're at a higher Fitzpatrick score. Those are the 3 things. And I'll be sure that the copy, if you're seeing this video or listening to it, I'll be sure the web copy has this written out so you can easily see which things you add on. And to be precise, I'm saying all of those that apply to you, count them all. So if one of those applies, count that. If multiple apply, count that. But if not, you would just pick one, count all that apply to you based upon your latitude, your Fitzpatrick score, and your body mass index, and then add them up all together. And think about retesting. It takes at least about 3 months to have your blood levels stabilize. And you could give as much as 6 to 12 months to check too and have that not be unreasonable. The target is 30 to 50 nanograms per mil. And the thing is, more than 50 nanograms per mil is not toxic. At this range of units, toxic doesn't start till above about 100 or more nanograms per mil, and that's a lot. But it doesn't work as well. So that's the paradox. Between 50 and 100 nanograms per mil, it gets less and less effective. And you want it to be effective. You want to be in that sweet spot where it's working well for you. So that's the goal behind that. And given these steps following that protocol, you can likely come quite close, if not at, that ideal place. You may need a little bit more, but based on those guidelines, you probably would not need less. So that was my big deep dive on vitamin D and what to do and how it's important for your immune system, your thyroid, your overall health, and how your needs can vary to person, how you can work around that. So I hope that was of some use, and hope that made sense of it to you, because it's a complicated topic and easy answers aren't the correct answers. This is important stuff and we want to get it right because health matters. So, all right, Dr. C with you. Take great care of yourself. Stay safe. Hope you're doing well. And I'll see you again real soon. Bye-bye.